To our people, this is a letter we have yet to send. We, as young people, are always learning and growing, while you, our fellow Asian American community members, guide us every step of the way. Your stories inspire us and remind us of our strengths and beauty, even as we are told that we are less because of our race. We grew up in spaces they may not have honored or respected our heritages and histories, but we intend to be active listeners, carrying the memories and lessons of our people as we move throughout our lives. We hope that in telling your stories, you are able to find healing, comfort, and release. We are listening, and we do care about your lives and memories. When we tell the stories of our families and communities, we reclaim our narratives and ensure more authenticity. We are able to piece together our fragmented stories and build a more complete sense of identity. We believe that stories, memories, and lived experiences are important forms of knowledge that Western knowledge systems often discount, saying that they are too subjective and personal. However, for thousands of years, stories have been a source of learning. Each person carries and creates their own narrative, but they also carry the stories of their ancestors and communities. With this letter, we invite our loved ones to find themselves in the stories of others. As Asian Americans, our stories are inextricable from imperialism. Our roots take us to India, the Philippines, Taiwan, China, Vietnam, Korea, and Japan. All of these countries possess colonial legacies, with some having been colonized while others have been the colonizer. As Americans, our country is built upon the genocide of indigenous peoples and the theft of their lands. Our government is actively funding the genocide of Palestinians. It's hard to know how to contend with these events and histories, but we believe that discussion is the first step. We want to acknowledge the hurt that our people have suffered, but also the strength they possess. Liberation lies in recognizing that our struggles are connected to those of others across the globe.
Is it the voices in your head keeping you in bed? Run me off the road again.
Can you please share your name, age, occupation, and where you grew up?
I'm Francis Wong. I am 67. I live in South San Francisco. I'm semi-retired. My main occupation is I'm a musician.
How would you describe your cultural identity and how has it shaped your life experiences?
You know, I would start with being the child of immigrant parents. My parents and thusly my family were refugees. My parents were refugees from the Chinese Civil War in 1949. I mean, growing up in the America of the 1960s and 70s, my identity was shaped by the African American and other BIPOC struggles for civil rights and for empowerment. I feel rooted in that struggle for equality and social justice.
What was your community like when you were growing up in the 60s and 70s?
I grew up in the Bay Area in South San Francisco, which is right outside of San Francisco. I guess we could be considered a suburb. We were just close enough to be, really part of the San Francisco cosmopolitan, which includes an Asian American community. So in my neighborhood around here, we had quite a few Asian Americans. In some ways, it was kind of like an Asian cluster. We would go into Chinatown pretty often, 2-3 times a month, to go for dim sum. We're connected to the Chinatown community that way. Later on, I became connected in high school to the Chinatown community through activism. My older brother was involved in the International Hotel. As a high schooler, I did attend events there. I grew up to grow into what was known as the Asian American movement. That was just starting when I was about 11 through the rest of my schooling in South San Francisco. Informal efforts to have an Asian American movement. We were involved in politics, we were involved in curriculum, but probably mostly around social identity, identify with each other.
You also mentioned that you went to Chinatown pretty often as a
Yeah.
kid. What are the importance of these kind of ethnic towns, I guess, in your opinion?
It was on a very basic level. It's like Chinatown, at least, back then. I mean, things are so different now, but this is in the 60s and 70s. Whenever there was a family gathering, you went to banquets in Chinatown. Chinatown represented a connection to my extended family that was largely immigrant. In that sense, like a lot of Chinatown, especially the banquet culture, was, somewhat reflective of a lot of folks who had come over from Hong Kong, which was my family as well. So that was important, a sense of connection. I think the other part of it was, for me, emerging sense of the politics of being Asian American and being Chinese American. There was stuff happening in Chinatown. So as I got older, politics was something that you are connected with. I began to have a sense that there was more to Chinatown than restaurants. There's actually a political life in Chinatown. It's a full experience. So if we don't have these communities, we're somewhat missing that possibility of having those spaces and then having that standing history. I think the other thing that we need to acknowledge is that the communities are not in a bubble. They're next to and in community with other communities. For example, the International Hotel was the last part of Manila town and continues to be that. And so this historic bond between Filipinos and Chinese working people continues to be practiced and celebrated, across the Kearny Street. And then it goes, since I participate in Japantown community, a lot of Filipinos in the Western Addition, because I have friends who grew up in the Western Addition, Filipino friends. But I also, oftentimes I talk about the jazz scene on Fillmore. So a lot of us Asian Americans who play jazz, it's part of that experience of being in the Western Addition. The fact that Japantown is in Western Addition and we played our music there. Even Japantown wasn't just Japanese. I mean, because a lot of Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans, a lot of Chinese Americans came to Japantown and continue to do so.
How do you recall gentrification happening within San Francisco in this kind of case? And have these communities stayed resilient to gentrification?
So it's really important to understand what was happening in the country, in the US, particularly in the post-World War II era. There was a certain push to modernize America based on its ascension to the leading world power in the post-World War II era, and also in relationship to the Cold War, relative to the Soviet Union and China. So what came about in the 50s, well, actually late 40s, really, pretty much all. So there was this kind of opportunity, of massive migration during World War II and then after World War II, where there could be a feeling of communities in flux. And so they started to have in some ways they started to, and then this is something probably I need to look up more, study more. We all need to understand more, but the idea of urban policy, I think that particularly in the post-World War II era, they were working on new urban policy. And in San Francisco, that was called, there was called, what was called the Model Cities Project. And actually,
Right.
if you go down to Market Street, there's this place called Justin Herman Plaza,
Hmm.
and he's known as like the
Oh.
first director of the Model Cities Project. And in the Model Cities Project, they had this term urban renewal.
Hmm. Been hearing that a lot working in
And
Japantown.
so, yeah, so in urban renewal throughout the country, they identified communities of color, probably most notably African American communities. One of the tropes in American society is that poor people are Black people because it's a way to divide the society and generate anti-Black attitudes. And so they would identify Black communities as blighted
Mm.
and target them for what they call urban renewal, which means tearing them down and building new structures, but basically moving people out, you know.
Hmm.
And in some ways, I mean, I don't have the academic background to say, but I do know that there was a concurrence of desegregation and urban renewal. But what it ended up doing was disrupting historic BIPOC communities. As part of that, since the Black community was right next to Japantown, Japantown was also identified as blighted. But part of it was this kind of policies did was to provide opportunities for developers,
Hmm.
you know. And so in Japantown, it was kind of that whole Japan Center project
Right. Hmm.
was part of the thing, make all those people, like I guess it was something like 1,000 families or something like that, and make them move and create this opportunity to create this build the Japan Center, which
Right.
would be a showcase for Japanese corporations. There was also global politics that's related to that because in the Cold War, Japan went very quickly from being the enemy of the United States to being the strongest ally of the United States. So there's a certain amount of promotion of the US-Japan
Yeah.
geopolitics, and then having a showcase for Japanese corporations and how that was a priority over living spaces for the historic Japanese American community, which, if you think about it, relatively soon after folks return from camp. So there's a certain kind of opportunity there in terms of instability of the community and then being hit by gentrification at this point. So rhetoric is very important. I've been hearing that,
Hmm.
been discussed now, how people talk about stuff, just like how people talk about Palestine, how
Hmm.
people talk about gentrification. So the way they talked about it was that it's part of urban renewal. It's a good thing.
Hmm.
It's redevelopment. When they say
Hmm.
redevelopment, but what was happening is people were losing their homes and somebody else was building on it. So
Yeah.
so so there's a certain, that's why I mentioned the last time we talked about this rhetoric around
Yeah.
gentrification. So what's also important is that people fought against urban
Hmm.
renewal and redevelopment. And there was
Yeah.
broad movements throughout the city because there was an understanding that because housing was a big issue because of course, families were coming back from the camps to San Francisco, and there was a big labor movement in San Francisco, and people wanted to, build housing. So that's why, ironically, next to the redevelopment of Japantown, there was the Longshoremen's Union built the
Mhm.
St. Francis Square, um, development, which was
Right.
for working people and veterans. So actually,
I have to sneeze.
Hi, Dad.
Hi.
So, hi everyone. This is my dad, Sean Wong. So, Dad, I'm gonna pass it over to you. Do you mind introducing yourself, your name, if your age, if you're comfortable, what do you do, your identities, and when you and your family immigrated, where you immigrated from, and where you currently live. We'll
My
go
name
one
is
by one.
Sean Wong. I'm a dentist as an occupation. I work at UCLA as a director of the student clinic. I also section chair for the group directors and the group leader in the student clinic. I've been in this country since I was age 13, and I'm currently 56. So that's many years, probably 40 plus years. I arrived here when I was a junior high student. I started freshman in college. I mean, high school when I first arrived here. So we immigrant from Taiwan, but it's sort of interesting. My parents sort of immigrant from China to Taiwan to basically as a way to avoid communists take over China in the 1940s. And so then they live in Taiwan. And during that period, we also started exploring leaving Taiwan to the United States.
So, the following question is, you always obviously been in the US for a really long time. You raised Andrew and I here, and we do go back and visit Taiwan, right? But where would you say you call home?
Home will be here. The reason I say here means the United States of America because I received my education here. I have my family here, and I established my career here. I have all my friends, all my relatives, and also my social network all in United States. So United States is currently I call home.
So when you go back, like when we go back to Taiwan, does it ever feel kind of foreign, or does it feel like, you never left it? Does it feel different?
It does feel different, particularly in Taiwan, because it has changed dramatically. When I left, it was still under the KMT control. So they are a lot more restrictive. And through the past 30, 40 years, Taiwan has progressed into one of the most democratic country in Asia. Whether people recognize Taiwan as a country or not, that's a different political discussion. But as far as the political system goes, it's probably one of the most mimicking the United States. So in that sense, when I go back to Taiwan, I'm not used to it because that's not how I were grown up all the way to junior high. Number one. Number two, when I go back there, I was mainly visiting relatives. So to me, it's a good place to visit, but it's not a place I can't call home at the moment.
And for those who don't know, even for myself, what is KMT you mentioned earlier?
Kuomintang is in Taiwan. It's actually used to be a nationalist party in China. They started a civil war with communist China. And as they start losing the civil war, they start to retreat different part of the China, eventually they retreated to Taiwan, and that's where the communist China not able to cross over the Taiwan Strait to invade China and create a unified China. There is a whole lot deep political implication behind that. Prior to 1949, China was known as the government as known as Republic China. After the communist takeover and after Mao Zedong declared China is no longer the old China, they created a new China under the national name, under the communist control, People's Republic of China. So in that sense, you're going to hear me saying mainland China, not really refer to People's Republic of China or PRC, when I refer to Taiwan, which really means Republic of China. So that's the differences.
So as Asian American, or as myself who's an Asian American, and yourself who has, I guess, an immigrant, but I feel have taken on a more Asian American identity. Obviously, imperialism and colonization have a strong presence in the homeland. Obviously, you know, with China's kind of, we see in the media and the news a lot encroaching on obviously wanting to take over Taiwan. And I know there are a lot of political unrest and uncertainty whether or not Taiwan is a country and all that. How would you say, if any, that sort of imperialism and colonization has personally impacted you? Or what are your viewpoints of it if you don't feel it really impacts you personally?
I don't feel it impact me personally, but it does impact me through a society perspective. In this particular case, since I was raised up in Taiwan, the real imperialism in this case, ironically, is not even China or United States. The imperialism is actually colonial. Taiwan was a colony of Japan, so it's under the Japanese colonialization of Taiwan. You will see a lot of influence in Taiwan that still remain with the Japanese influence. One very good example, if you look at Taiwan's railroad, the railroad arrangement is exactly like Japan. Instead of if you go north, should be on the right side of the rail, and going south should be the left side. They are reversed, just like in Japan, just like in British Empire. Everything is different than how Americans are used to certain ways, a certain direction. For example, we drive on the right side, whereas British and Japanese drive on the left side. And those are typical example I can show almost right away. There's still influence in Taiwan. As a result of that, their high-speed rail are reversed, so people can get really confused because their high-speed rail is designed by the European company, same as Taipei's subway is designed by European company, so they're reversed as well. Other things, you definitely can see some of the Taiwan structure have a lot of Japanese influence. The older houses, things like that. You even see some of the Japanese decoration in outskirts of the countryside of Taiwan. So do they have a direct influence on me personally? Probably very little. I can tell you when I was growing up in Taiwan, I have to get a crew cut, and that's the Japanese student during those periods had to do. So I had to get crew cut because that was the way kind of passed down from Japanese colonialism. But politically, that did not stay in Taiwan ever since nationalist China take over. The education and all the other stuff is much more Americanized. Again, is that an imperialism? I can't judge that because nationalist China and the United States were allies back then, and then they are also allied against communist expansion throughout the 60s, 70s, all the way to now. They get a lot of American support, militarily, advisory function from agriculture, economic, and even political advisory to make Taiwan more democratic. So is that an imperialism, or that it's a progression of a societal evolution? It's hard to judge. So I cannot really pinpoint, is that imperialism or is a progress made due to westernization of their political system and cultural value.
Well, I think that's the tricky thing too, because when you were talking about Japan, Japanese influence, because when I went this summer, Professor Liang also talked a lot about the remnants of, Japanese influence in a lot of maybe the foods, or obviously talked about infrastructure and even culture. So I'd say what we see today in terms of Japan's colonialism during Taiwan back then, a lot of it has more cultural and more infrastructure remnants. Another point I wanted to kind of talk about was also the influence of the Han Chinese people kind of migrating into Taiwan and the displacement of the native peoples that were there before. I believe like the Hakka people and all these other native tribes that were there prior. What are your views on that, especially as someone who was in the education system for a little bit? And were you taught about these things in school,
Yeah.
or did you come
Yeah,
to learn
no.
this only when you went to university?
It was not talked about much in the school, and it's follow almost exact the same pattern that you can see in the United States. The old Aborigine people, the original people, native, like a Native American, got displaced by more technological advanced ethnicity that follows. So Aborigine in Taiwan got displaced by the Han Chinese, Hakka Chinese, Fukienese. Then they got colonized by Japan, and the Japanese influenced those. And after the Japanese lost the Second World War II, when nationalists took over, then the people that run away from the communists are typically, I'm not saying all of them, but typically are intellectuals, are people well educated. They start displacing some of the original Fukienese, Hakkanese. Definitely negative impact if you want to look at perspective of the cultural richness. There is a push, you only speak Mandarin as your official language. So some of the smaller Aboriginal tribe, their language got lost.
First impression.
It's crispy, it's crunchy, and it's greasy, but I like it.
Yeah.
Hi, so this is my sister, Nathara. Do you want to give some background about yourself?
Okay, so background about myself. I am Nithara Murthy. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am 24 years old. I currently live in Toledo, Ohio. I'm a third year medical student. In terms of my relation to the AAPI community, my parents are immigrants from India. They came here in the 80s and they settled in Arizona, which is where I've lived most of my life. I was born and raised there.
Okay. And this follow-up question to that is, where do you call home and how did this come to be?
So that's a really good question. I think that something that many people who are children of immigrants can probably relate to is the feeling of not really knowing where exactly to call home. I will say that I've been in Arizona the longest, so I can probably say that I would consider Arizona my home. That being said, I think for a very long time, it was always very difficult for me to establish a feeling of connection to a certain place because I never really felt like I belonged in Arizona or in any one place. I more so always thought as home being connected to, my family, my friends, people that I cared about. And I think this happens for a lot of people that, grow up where they are children of immigrants. Many people who are children of immigrants can probably relate to. I don't want to speak for everyone, but it's the feeling, at least for me, home was always connected more to certain people and a feeling of home that they gave me versus a place like Arizona. And I think that a lot of this is because a large experience of my time growing up in Arizona, I always did feel like I didn't belong there. I did feel like an outsider. Because a lot of times, when people look at me, they consider me as Indian, and I consider myself as Indian. But you're always in this weird in between where you're Indian American or anything, you're blank American. And a lot of people only ever see you as one or the other. So I could never say, oh, my home is India, because I know that if I went there, I would never have, I wouldn't be who I am currently today. I would be a very different person. But that being said, the experience of like having immigrant parents and Indian culture has shaped me a lot.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what you said about kind of people putting you in a box, so like either Indian or American, but do you feel like you don't really fully belong in either box or perceived as that? I thought that was interesting because I think a lot of people, like immigrants or first generation people, can agree with that, especially coming from like an ANHPI country in that area. So the next question I'm going to ask is, what are the push and pull factors of immigration? Why did you or your family come to America? And why did you or your family leave the home country? And I think for us, this is a little bit different because we're not immigrants, but our parents were. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I think opportunity, I would say, and I think that's something that most immigrants say. I think currently in the US, there's a very divisive political climate going on. And I know that a lot of the narratives that get spread about immigrants are that, jobs are here for like Americans or something like that. But I think that what a lot of the times draws immigrants to America, and especially was the case for my parents, was a lack of opportunity in their home country, and a desire to pursue, to be able to like leave that climate. So India is very, very competitive. Many other ethnic countries have like a similar situation, but it's incredibly cutthroat. There are very few educational opportunities. Everything is expensive. So if you don't have money, it's very difficult for you to have opportunities to make it anywhere. And even if you happen to, be able to like get into college and be educated, the likelihood of you getting a job that allows you to be able to make an income it's much harder to survive in India than it is to survive here. Or you have to be the best of the best. Only the best of the best are able to get to that point. But a lot of people, when they come here to the US, more than anything, they're looking for the promise of building their lives. And so they want to contribute to the country. They want to be a part of the country. I know that wasn't exactly the question, but I always think it's like important in a way to kind of address the underlying contextual questions of, it's never really like bad intentions that bring immigrants to the country. I mean, I'm sure as with anything, there's always like a small minority, but most people who want to come to this country genuinely want what every single person wants, a chance to better their lives and the lives of those after them.
No, I agree. And I think that's a really good way to show how, like, I think immigrants really do shape a lot of this country because of the reasons that they came here for. And they're just looking for a better life for their kids and for future generations. So, as an AAPI, imperialism and colonization have had a strong presence in our homelands. How have imperialism and colonization personally impacted you?
Well, I can say in many ways that they've personally impacted me. A lot of, I think, what I would say has to actually do with like beauty standards. I know that that's something that's not super overt. It is overt in a way, but it's not as like overt or oppressive as colonialism has really impacted the standard of beauty. And I can see that in very clear ways because in terms of, I'm trying to figure out a way to put it into words how much of an impact that this can actually have on somebody's psyche, because I think the difficulty is that white Eurocentric faces and body structures are kind of, to some extent now, idealized in India because of colonialism. There's so many things that the British left behind when they colonized India. For example, and I was talking about this with our dad actually, but the British left behind schools, for example, right? And those schools taught English as like a language, if that makes sense. And when you go to a lot of the smaller, more rural villages in India that don't maybe have those British public schools, you'll see a lot more retention of cultural languages actually than you do see in places where, because again, the British mode of education was to promote English as a main language. And in a lot of ways, it's ironic and sad at the same time. I know this isn't the beauty standard, I'll get to that in a second, but I was going to say that in a lot of ways, it's very sad because although, our parents like knew English, for example, when they came here because they were educated in British schools, our dad doesn't know any language fluent.
Mhm.
He doesn't know Tamil fluently, which is our native tongue. He only learned Hindi up until like 8th standard or 8th grade, as they call it. And in a lot of ways, it's very similar to what they did to Native Americans here in the United States, where they set up these schools to try to quote unquote strip people of their identities and promote one form of identity as superior, right?
Mhm.
And inadvertently, like, it very much has helped our parents in helping them come here, but it's also caused a lot of lack of ties essentially to their cultural heritage, their knowledge, to the language. So
Mhm.
if you take my dad in context, he lived in one place, which was, a city,
Mhm.
and that was a British school that he went to. And I kind of told you he doesn't have much ties to like the language. Whereas
Mhm.
when you take my mom, she traveled around India because her dad was in the Air Force. And because of
Mhm.
that, she basically lived in places where she wasn't necessarily always British educated, like, or in British educated schools. So she actually picked up so many languages. And that's one of the most beautiful things about India is like the diversity of the languages and the cultures there. You can go across one place and there's I think like at least 25 languages. I don't want to like I
Mhm.
don't want to quote a number and not be sure, but there's a huge amount of languages in India.
Mhm.
And so
By decentering imperialist narratives and centering those who have been affected, we aim to nurture intergenerational connections while dismantling exclusionary systems of injustice that prioritize Western agendas. We keep our loved ones close by keeping their memories alive.